Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're stepping back, way back,
Yeah.
into Japan's Edo period. It was this world, structured by really strict social rules. And we're going to explore a figure who's, well, pretty unique and complex. Danzaemon?
That's right. We're diving into the sources you shared. Looks like a briefing doc and a Wikipedia excerpt.
Yep.
Both digging into this hereditary leader of the Ida and Hinin communities. These were groups really marginalized by the society of the time.
And our goal, our mission for this deep dive, we want to understand who this Danzaemon figure actually was.
Yeah.
How did he get such immense authority over these groups? What about the economic power he apparently had?
And the challenges he faced, too. There was resistance.
Definitely. And maybe most surprisingly, his connection later on to Japan's modernization in the Meiji era.
Yeah.
We really want to pull out the most fascinating bits from this material.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. Edo, Japan. We're talking about a very rigid social hierarchy.
Super rigid.
You have the samurai at the top, then farmers, artisans, merchants. But below all of them were these other groups discriminated against. The sources specifically named the Eta and the hinin.
And these groups, they were often tied to jobs considered, well, impure back then, dealing with death, leatherworking, even begging.
Exactly. They were pushed to the fringes, faced a lot of prejudice.
And right into this world comes Danzaemon, the hereditary head of these communities, specifically in the Kanto region, right near Edo, the shogun's capital.
Now, his official title from the shogunate was etagashira, which literally means, head of the Eta.
But it's interesting, the sources point out that he and his family, they didn't really use that title themselves. They preferred chōrigashira Yano Danzaemon.
Chōrigashira. Yeah, that's a subtle but maybe important difference. The shogunate's term ties him directly to the discriminated group.
Right.
But chōrigashira. Some historians think that title might link back to older, maybe administrative or legal roles. Perhaps it was a way for the family to assert a different kind of legitimacy, a deeper history.
Makes sense. And his main base was in Asakusa in Edo. So people just called him Asakusa Danzaemon.
Which tells you right away his power base was smack in the middle of the shogun's city.
Pretty remarkable for a leader of marginalized groups.
It really is.
So how does one family end up in this position? The sources mentioned a big power shift happening during that transition from the Sengoku period, the Warring States time, to this stable Edo Shogunate.
Yeah, before the Tokugawa took over completely, there was another guy, Danzaemon. He was based near Odawara in Sunuhara, and he was apparently the dominant figure among these outcast groups in the Kanto region.
And Danzaemon.
Danzaemon was further south near Kamakura, less powerful at that point.
But then Tokugawa Ieyasu comes in, defeats the local Huju clan in 1590.
Right. And Danzaemon tries to hold on to his power. He apparently showed Ieyasu some old document from the previous rulers backing his claim.
But Ieyasu wasn't having it.
No. The sources say Ieyasu rejected the claim, even confiscated the document, and instead he grants control over the Kanto outcast communities to Danzaemon.
Okay, wait. Why pick the less powerful guy? That feels a bit backwards.
It does, doesn't it? And the sources offer a speculated reason, which is really fascinating.
What is it?
The thinking might have been that Danzaemon would just be easier for Ieyasu and the new shogunate to control, compared to Danzaemon, who was maybe more established, more independent. So it wasn't about existing power, it was maybe a strategic calculation. Who could they manage better?
Choosing the path of least resistance, potentially. And once Danzaemon got this backing, his authority just exploded.
Oh, absolutely immense. The shogunate gave him jurisdiction over these populations across pretty much the entire Kanto region. Huge area of eastern Japan.
Any exception?
Just tiny ones mentioned, like the Mido domain and some territories around the Nikko shrines. But his reach also went south into Izu, and even into parts of Kai, Suruga, Mutsu, and Mikawa provinces.
Wow, that's extensive.
And it wasn't just geographical. He also held this title, Huragashira.
What did that mean?
That basically gave him the authority to issue directives like official notices, not just in his Kanto base, but potentially to Eta and Hinin communities all across Japan.
So regional administration, but nationwide influence.
That seems to be the implication, a communication network that could span the whole country.
The sources mention an early document, the Danzaemon Yuishosho. Though they flag it might be forged.
Right. A bit of skepticism there.
It apparently listed the groups he was supposed to control initially. hinin, different kinds of performers, some artisans, even brothel owners.
But the same sources quickly point out that a lot of these groups, especially the artisans, managed to break free from his control pretty early on in the Edo period.
Which brings us to resistance. And there are some really striking stories here, including one that remarkably connects to pop culture.
Yeah, this is a great bit from the sources. So, in 1708, this puppeteer from Kyoto, Kobayashi Shinsuke, he actually sued Danzaemon.
Sued him? For what?
For obstructing his performances, basically interfering with his livelihood. He won, which was apparently a huge deal. This victory led to puppeteers and also kabuki actors getting out from under Danzaemon's jurisdiction.
Wow, a successful legal challenge.
And here's the really cool part. The connection the sources make to kabuki history. You know the famous play Sukaroku, part of the classic kabuki Juhachiban collection?
Yeah, of course. Very famous.
It was first performed in 1713. And the sources suggest it might have been created specifically to celebrate this very liberation from Danzaemon.
Seriously, the play itself was a celebration of breaking free.
That's the theory presented. The legendary actor Ichikawa Danjuro II supposedly created it to celebrate getting out from under what they saw as Danzaemon's oppressive control.
Incredible.
And get this, the villain in the play, Hiji no Ikkyu, he's thought to be modeled directly on the Danzaemon who was in power around that time, Danzaemon Shusei, who died in 1709.
So the villain was based on the real Danzaemon?
Seems like it. Apparently, early performances made that connection pretty clear to the audience, like a direct jab.
A popular play as a form of public commentary, even protest. That's fascinating.
It really is. Now, inspired by this success, another leader, a hinin leader named Kuruma Zenshichi, also tried suing Danzaemon.
Did he win too?
No, Danzaemon actually won that case in 1722, so it wasn't a total loss of control.
So, who did remain under his thumb until the later Edo period?
According to the sources, primarily the hinin groups and certain sort of lower status performers, things like sarukai monkey trainers and katsumun, who were basically beggars but used performance in their begging.
Though even there, the system wasn't perfectly neat, right? There were exceptions.
Right. Some of those same groups, monkey trainers, theater performers, even no actors, and Mikawa Manzai performers, they were managed by a completely different family, the Tsuchimikado.
The descendants of Abe no Seimei, the famous Onmyu-do master.
The very same. So yeah, not a totally monolithic control structure under Danzaemon.
Okay, so beyond the shogun's decree and just inheriting the position, where did Danzaemon's actual day-to-day power come from? It seems like economics was key.
Absolutely central. The sources are clear. His power rested heavily on economic monopolies.
Monopolies on what?
Control over making and selling specific goods. Leather products are mentioned prominently, also things like lamp wicks and various bamboo crafts.
Why was leather such a big deal?
Well, the sources stress that leather production was seen as a vital military industry, essential for making armor, saddles, other equipment.
Military necessity.
Exactly. And because it was crucial for the military, the rulers, the shogunate, protected it. And that protection solidified Danzaemon's control over it and the wealth that came from it.
And his personal wealth. It sounds like it was pretty staggering, especially considering the poverty of the people he oversaw.
It really seems so. The sources say his position was hereditary, and he had privileges usually reserved for samurai, like carrying 2 swords.
Okay.
And his wealth, purportedly comparable to a hatamoto, a direct vassal of the shogun, or even a daimyo, a feudal lord.
Wow. Can they quantify that?
They give estimates. His status was seen as equivalent to someone with a 10,000 koku stipend, but his actual financial power might have been closer to 50,000 koku.
50,000 koku.
Yeah.
Just to remind people, 1 koku was roughly the amount of rice needed to feed 1 person for a year. So that's immense wealth.
Immense. And this leads to a really critical point the sources highlight. This huge gap, this stark contrast between Danzaemon's riches and the often desperate poverty of the Ida and hinin communities under his control.
So he was profiting directly from their marginalized status and labor.
It seems unavoidable to conclude that from the sources. His monopolies enabled that. And this disparity, the sources note, really cemented a negative reputation for the Danzaemon family over many generations.
It's a powerful picture of how these structures can work, enriching one figure while overseeing widespread poverty.
The sources also mention the family's own historical claims, how they tried to legitimize this unique position.
Right, in that Danzaemon Yuisho Sho document, the one flagged as potentially forged.
Exactly. They put forward these grand claims of ancient lineage.
Like what?
Descent from the Hata clan, who were immigrants from ancient Qin China, a connection to a retainer of Taira no Masamori way back, even a claim that a medieval ancestor heading the Chushri received a special seal from Minamoto no Yoritomo himself back in 1180.
Establishing this ancient right to rule these groups.
That seems to be the goal. But the sources are quick to caution there's really no solid historical evidence for these claims before the Edo period itself.
So historians see it more as, what, a strategic narrative?
Pretty much. An attempt by the family to construct this deep historical legitimacy. And circling back to Ieyasu's decision, the theory is the shogunate might have found it convenient to just accept these claims, or at least not dig too deep. It helped justify why they empowered Danzaemon over the seemingly more established Tarsaemon.
Made the whole arrangement look more historically grounded, perhaps. Let's picture his base in Asakusa. The sources give a location, right?
They do. Between Amato Bridge and Sanya Bridge, along the Amaya Moat, roughly where the Tokyo Metropolitan Asakusa High School playground is now.
And it wasn't just a house. It sounds like a whole compound.
Oh yeah, a large enclosed area called Asakusa Shinmachi, or sometimes the Danzaemon enclosure.
Enclosed house.
Surrounded by temples, shrines, and even walls, apparently to keep prying eyes out. Inside you had Danzaemon's office, his private residence, warehouses for all those monopoly goods.
Leather, wicks, bamboo crafts.
Right. Also a shrine within the compound, and housing for maybe 300 to 400 families who worked for his administration.
And crucially, he had legal power there, too.
Yes. The sources mention he had judicial authority within his domain. He held court, had his own jail.
So he could judge and punish his subordinates, and the Eda and Hinin in nearby shogunate lands.
Effectively acted as a magistrate within his sphere, a significant amount of delegated authority from the shogunate.
It sounds like quite the place. Does any of it still exist?
Sadly, no. The sources say very little, if anything, remains. Damaged heavily by the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, and then the bombing of Tokyo during World War II. The shrine that was inside the compound was eventually merged into the nearby Amato Shrine.
A shame. Another piece of history lost to disaster.
Yeah. But the story doesn't end with the Edo period. The sources take us forward to the 13th Danzaemon.
Right, he was active in the late Edo period, during all that turmoil leading up to the Meiji Restoration.
Exactly, the Bakumatsu period, those final chaotic years of the shogunate. And something interesting happens to him. January 1868, right on the cusp of the Restoration.
What was that?
He, along with 65 of his subordinates, were officially elevated to commoner status hinin.
Why?
Apparently as a reward for cooperating with the shogunate during something called the Chūshū expedition, which was a military campaign.
So loyalty rewarded, even as the old system was crumbling. And he started changing his name.
He did. First to Dan Naiki. Then, after the Meiji Restoration happened, the big shift in 1868, overthrowing the shogun, bringing back the emperor, starting modernization, he changed it again to Dan Naoki.
Dan Naoki. And he becomes quite significant in this new Meiji era.
He does, in a really interesting way. The sources say Dan Naoki got involved in developing Japan's modern leather industry and also the Western-style shoe industry.
Wait, the very industries his family had controlled through monopolies under the old discriminatory system?
Exactly. He pivots, using that knowledge and connection perhaps to become involved in the industrial modernization of those same trades. He lived until 1889.
That's quite a transformation, from hereditary leader of outcasts under feudalism to an industrial figure in modernizing Japan.
It really complicates the narrative, doesn't it? And the sources even trace the family name and potential descendants right up to recent times.
Where's the family grave?
It's at Honri-Juji Temple in Amato, right across the street from where the residence used to be, actually. And the grave marker says, Yano Shihaka, Yano family grave.
So they kept the original surname, Yano.
Mostly, it seems. The tombstone lists descendants up to the 15th generation who passed away in 1960, all under the Yano name.
But there was that other theory about descendants using the name Dan.
Right, and the sources clarify that. It seems Dan wasn't adopted wholesale by the family. It was primarily used by the 13th generation, Dan Naoki himself, and then continued by his adopted son, Dan Risuke.
So the Dan surname follows that specific line from the 13th generation.
That appears to be the case, based on the Tato Ward history cited.
Are any specific descendants mentioned who bridge this history?
Yes, a figure named Yunosuke, identified as either a son or adopted son of the 13th generation who also went by Dan Shinpei or Yano Shinpei. This Yunosuke co-managed a company that was a forerunner of Tokyo Leather Co., Ltd.
still in the leather business.
And interestingly, he apparently made a donation to a reconciliation conference back in 1921 using the name Dan Shinpei. So still connected to the industry and maybe even broader social issues.
Where might relatives be today? Any clues?
The sources mention possibilities. Matsumoto City in Nagano, Utsunomiya City in Tochigi, Aichi Prefecture, and there's even a theory about Sendai City.
Kind of scattered.
But then there's this really concrete, recent anecdote shared in the sources. From the deputy director of the Leather Industry Museum, he recounts that in 2015, during a special exhibit about Danzaemon, a visitor came forward. And this visitor presented a family register abstract, like an official family tree document.
Showing a connection.
A direct documented connection. It traced their ancestry back 5 generations, right to Dan Naoki, and specifically named Dan Naoki's eldest daughter, Sumi, as their grandmother.
Wow. So a confirmed living descendant tracing directly back to the 13th Danzaemon Dan Naoki.
Exactly. It's a remarkable link described in the sources, connecting this historical figure, this leader of marginalized communities, directly to people living today.
Incredible. Okay, let's try and pull this all together. What have we learned about Danzaemon from these sources?
Well, he emerges as this incredibly complex figure, doesn't he? He's the hereditary head, the administrator of these deeply discriminated against communities in Edo, Japan.
Great. A position granted and upheld by the shogunate, seemingly for strategic reasons of control.
Right. And he wielded immense economic power through these key monopolies, leather being central. This let him amass a personal fortune comparable to high-ranking samurai.
But that wealth stands in really stark, uncomfortable contrast to the poverty of the Eta and hinin he oversaw. The sources suggest his position allowed him to profit from their marginalized status.
Definitely a controversial aspect. He also faced resistance, legal challenges, losing control over some groups, even becoming the inspiration, apparently, for a kabuki villain.
And while his family put forward these grand historical claims to legitimize their rule, the sources treat those skeptically, pointing back to the Tokugawa shogunate's decision as the real foundation of his power.
And the story doesn't just stop in Edo. Later generations, like the 13th Danzaemon becoming Dan Naoki, pivot and participate directly in Japan's industrial modernization.
Especially in the leather industry, the very trade tied to their historical power. And we even have documented links mentioned in the sources to living descendants today.
And just to reiterate, everything we've discussed, all these details and interpretations, they come directly from that briefing document and the Wikipedia excerpt provided for this deep dive.
Danzaemon's story, it really feels like a unique window, doesn't it? Into the intricate and often harsh social reality of Edo, Japan.
Yeah.
It highlights the lives of these outcast communities, but also shows how power could be concentrated in surprising ways within that system.
It definitely challenges simple narratives. Figures like Danzaemon, they don't fit easily. They were leaders of marginalized groups, yes, but also political players, economic power brokers whose wealth was intertwined with that marginalization.
And that later involvement in modernization just adds another layer of complexity to how we think about their legacy.
Absolutely.
It really makes you think about the nature of power and control, especially within communities facing that kind of systemic discrimination. What does his story really tell us about those dynamics? And how do figures like him, who defy easy categorization, how do they shape our understanding of history, of social change? Yeah. It definitely leaves you wondering, what other complex, maybe hidden histories are out there that could totally reshape how we view periods we thought we knew? That's always the question, isn't it? There's always more beneath the surface.